Hey, it's Alex Williams with the New Stack. Sitting in my hotel room just after DockerCon and thinking, my gosh, this is our 50th show that we're posting here today. Very exciting, and just feels good to get to this point, and just want to thank you for listening. And we've seen a steady increase in the community out there, and we're interested in what this new ecosystem is all about. So, thanks for being a part of it. I'd like to thank all our sponsors too, who've been a tremendous help in making the New Stack possible. In this show, we concluded DockerCon and had a discussion with the folks from DramaFever who've been using Docker in production just about as long as anyone. I was joined by Scott Fulton, our senior writer extraordinaire, who has been doing a fantastic job of covering the Docker ecosystem. And finally, I'd like to just give a plug for our container ebook series. You can learn more about it at the New Stack. Just do a search for DockerCon 15, and you should see the post and the sign up for the ebook series to get a little preview of what we have there. Thanks again, all, and you can reach me on Twitter at Alex Williams. My email is alex@thenewstack.io. Thanks a lot. You are listening to the New Stack Analyst Podcast. Each week, we discuss our latest data research in a topic related to app development and back-end services. Now let's get to the show. Hi, I'm Alex Williams with the New Stack here for the New Stack Analyst Show, and today I'm with Scott Fulton of the New Stack. Bridget, how do you pronounce your last name?
Kramhout.
Bridget Kramhout of DramaFever and Tim Gross of DramaFever. So Scott's a colleague at the New Stack. He's one of our. He is. I would call Scott our senior writer, and he does a great job in covering all this world. And so we wanted to have his perspective. And you guys are actually using Docker in production. Maybe you guys could tell us a little bit about your company and what it is and what you guys do.
Sure. We're a streaming video company. You might say we're a Netflix for foreign television. We stream a lot of East Asian content to mostly North American and South American audience. Oh. And we also are currently running 2 sites for AMC, the Doc Club, which is the documentary site, and Shudder, which is launching next week, I think, which is a horror site.
Oh, okay. So how do you work with these folks? You just doing the streaming itself?
It's actually a kind of a top to bottom. We kind of run their business for them for these sites. So we do marketing, we run the operations of the site, we do the development, we do the content procurement, the kind of the whole soup to nuts kind of environment. So it's really more of a partnership than a turnkey solution.
How old is the company?
We're 5 years old. We were started as a kind of a very small startup, and then we were acquired by SoftBank Internet Media in October of last year.
Okay, so you're pre-Docker.
Well, I mean, the company was around before Docker, definitely.
Sure. Yeah.
But I joined the company in mid-2014, and one of the things that made it exciting to join an organization like this was the fact that they were already running Docker in production and had been since about October 2013. Tim, do you want to give us a little bit of background on what led you to going to Docker at that point?
Sure. So at that point, we'd grown from a very, very tiny engineering team to kind of a mid-sized team, maybe 20 people. It was taking us a really long time to get a build onto production, and there was a lot of differences between it's kind of the classic story of like, well, it's working on my machine, so why isn't it working on production? So we needed a solution that was going to say, let's make something that we know is going to be the identical on the build server to what is going out in production. So we had kind of looked at a couple of different things, and Docker stood out to me and my colleague Paul, and we decided that this was really going to be a bit of a risk because it was still very early. I think it was version 6 or 0.6. But we kind of always thought there was going to be a fallback to Linux containers. But we did it, and it's worked out really well for us. And our builds are now, it takes a half hour to get from a verified QA build that everybody is signed off on production and live serving with us. So that's really great for us. And I think it's also really dramatically improved the development environment as well, because it could take a full day or more for a developer to get up to speed, just in terms of like getting their development environment set up and making sure that it was going to, even remotely match what was in production. And today, we can get a new developer up and running and, on their first day before lunch.
Really?
And then ready to go.
Within minutes, really. I mean, Docker pull, Docker run.
Yeah.
It's not hard.
Yeah. So you came into DockerCon 15 here in San Francisco. What have you been experiencing in production that you wanted to learn more about to help you out and, improve your production environment, solve some problems you've been having, or maybe extend what you're doing?
Yeah, so as we've been scaling out, we've realized that we want to re-examine and improve some pieces of our orchestration, looking at service discovery, that sort of thing. And there's a lot of new tools in the Docker ecosystem, but there's enough new tools that sometimes it's challenging to figure out which ones are applicable to your use case or exactly how you want to put them together. So from the demos that we saw today and from some of the talks today, what was the stuff that really stood out for you, Tim?
I think that the Mesos and Marathon pairing seems to be really potentially very powerful. The talk from the folks at Disney was very similar to the sort of thing I could see working in our environment, both in terms of like what it is going to look like to the developers and what it's going to look like to us in operations.
What are you doing now?
So right now we don't really have a very good orchestration set up. So we're deployed fully on Amazon Web Services. So we bake a golden image Amazon machine image, and that's the host. And then we have upstart jobs there that pull the container that they're configured with. We have a mapping of one container to one host right now. And that's okay, but it's not as resource efficient as we would like it to be. So that's kind of that's one of the things that we want to really fix.
Now we saw, this is Scott Fulton, we saw some demonstrations here this week of not only some new tooling, but some new directions in the Docker ecosystem, Run-C being probably one of the biggest ones. Is that going to have any impact on the work you do for your clients?
Not directly. I think the thing that it's going to do is it's going to allow the ecosystem to mature a lot more than it is now. I think one of the reasons I want to add a little bit to something Bridget was saying earlier about coming here and looking at the tools and the demos and the talks, but also kind of the hallway track in terms of saying, okay, you've been using Mesos, like what are the, even if I didn't talk to someone even if it wasn't somebody's talk, what are the things they're really running into? How are they solving some of the kind of nitty-gritty problems and being able to kind of talk to them in person and people I wouldn't normally be exposed to. So kind of coming back to to actually answer your question. So there's a big ecosystem of tools, but they're not really mature. And I think that having this kind of common runtime is going to give it a lot more opportunity for there to be more mature tools coming out, because I think it'll increase the diversity of people who can really put their hands on the core.
That's a key thing, isn't it? It's the kind of the broadening of the community.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and I think also when you see fragmentation in a community, it can end up dividing the efforts that it would be better to see them working towards a common goal of improving the ecosystem for everyone.
Right.
So I was really happy to see Docker and CoreOS coming together on this, just because I think it's more constructive. It's more useful for everyone.
But it's actually a very limited scope to what they did open source, and there's some developer APIs that that haven't even discussed yet.
Sure,
that could be open sourced. Would that make a difference?
Perhaps indirectly. I mean, not necessarily for our specific use case, but
yeah. So in Solomon's keynote, he was talking about there's kind of these different tiers of people who are involved in this, and although to some respect us as operations folks are internet plumbers with respect to our own companies, we're not the low level tool makers who are going to be contributing necessarily to Docker development, right? And I think that this kind of Run-C, this open sourcing stuff is really going to have the biggest direct impact on the tool makers for these things, and not so much those of us who are kind of have to use them on an operational basis, except in as much that more accessibility to the development folks is going to make for a bigger diversity of tools, and that's so I think.
So in that way, it's going to be helpful,
right?
Because it potentially widens the area of impact from today's and yesterday's announcements. Widens the area of the people who are actually going to be contributors. Like they said, there's already more contributors than there were yesterday, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's one of the things that I've seen, which is very interesting to me, is how some very large companies have gotten interested in Docker very early on and have gone kind of aggressively for it, and that's very interesting, kind of in the abstract to me. But we're not gonna be running our workloads on Windows. That's just not the way that we're running our company. So it's very interesting to me. But what the kind of the new direction in terms of the open source means is that there are going to be some of the smaller developers who are going to be able to say, this is more accessible to me now, and now I can build some kind of tool that maybe wouldn't come out of that ecosystem and would be more applicable, maybe potentially more applicable for us.
What is your technology stack as it stands?
It's we run Ubuntu Linux on AWS. Our applications, we have a kind of the legacy monolithic Django Python app, and then we've been kind of pulling pieces out of that over the last couple of years, and so we're running somewhere between, I think it's around 10 different microservices that are all written in Go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when did you go ahead?
Oh, and it's probably also useful to point out that we use AWS managed storage and caching for our persistence layers. So because we auto scale up and down so aggressively with our traffic patterns, our instances and our application runs in a fairly stateless manner.
Mm-hmm.
The instances can go away, and that's okay.
I think the average lifespan, because we have this kind of TV time sort of load swing, our instances live, I think, maybe an average of 18 hours. I think it is.
Mm-hmm. What would you like to see Amazon do to improve its Docker, to improve its platform for Docker, and for you as a customer?
Yeah, I think the Elastic Container Service looked interesting as kind of a prototype. I have to be honest that I kind of looked at it when the preview came out, and it didn't seem mature enough, because it was the sort of idea like, run one container on one instance. And they've definitely improved it since then. I know that they're making it to a more mature platform. I don't know what the story is around service discovery for that. So it's something it's going to be one of the potential candidates for our management system, but I don't know yet whether it's the right tool
I
for
think
us.
one of the things Amazon does not have a lot of transparency around is exactly what they mean by high or moderate, or how you can even compare the performance of one thing to another. And that does make it sometimes tricky and just kind of experimental and anecdotal to try to figure out how things will actually work. So that might be something where we're going to have to try it and see.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There have been some folks privately commenting here the last few days that perhaps the Docker ecosystem or the container ecosystem as a whole would benefit from competition from another major player, somebody who could either rise to Docker's level, or someone who could come in from the outside, maybe a known player, make an investment in producing an OCP-capable container standard, come up with some tooling, support some of the tooling that's already out there, like Mesosphere, and perhaps make this a market with the plurality. If that were to happen over, say, the next 2 or 3 years, would that help you at DramaFever in any respect?
Potentially, it depends on it depends on whether it's a legitimate, whether it's a legitimate and serious contender for those in terms of quality and reliability. I think that.
And the developer experience. I mean, we're operations people, so we're focusing mostly on, orchestration on at scale on a server level. But one of the things that makes Docker so great is that it is very easy to use on an individual developer level as well. So anyone who's coming in and playing in that space, I think, has to think all the way up and down on that stack.
Well,
go ahead.
there are some folks in other open source ecosystems that say quality is improved through some type of healthy competition, especially in providers of OpenStack and providers of Hadoop and things like that.
Well, and,
so if
Cloud Foundry is doing some interesting stuff with Lattice, I mean, we're keeping an eye on that. There are other pieces going on out there for sure.
So conceivably, you'd see at least the potential for an improvement in the ecosystem if Docker were to be joined in this space by somebody at Docker's caliber.
Sure.
I think having more options is always better.
Yeah.
Why would having fewer options be better? I mean, that way lies closed source and sadness.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing that you worry about is does it start fragmenting? The thing that you might worry about is does it start fragmenting the development community around? Well, half the development community who might be working on this sort of thing starts working on, option X, and the other ones are still working on Docker. But I think
that's where open standards help a lot, though.
Yeah, and I don't
Make
think
stuff more portable.
And I think that what we've seen over the last 2 years now with the great enthusiasm with which people have started to take this on, including some of the really big players, I don't think we're going to be short of development.
But it seems for you guys like you're on your way with Docker, you're moving on with Docker, that Docker is serving as your, as a foundation for you. Mm-hmm. I'm curious about your views on the ecosystem around Docker, right? So you're interested in what they're talking about at Walt Disney today, right? Mm-hmm. And what are some of the other tools you're looking at to help you fill out that container, environment that you're building?
I mean, we have added other tools. Even after having Docker and using Docker in production, we added, as you heard Disney talking about, they used Chef to define their images and Packer to build them. And we actually added that ourselves earlier this year without having known that Disney was doing it. But things like that, like being able to make sure you also have control of your entire host substrate. Like, everything inside the container is great, but you also need to make sure that you have control of what's outside the container. Mm-hmm. So I'm watching some of the other tools out of HashiCorp with interest. Some people today were talking about Console and getting some good results from it. So we've tested it a little, so we're still looking at that. And then the Mesos and Marathon stuff.
Or Swarm. That's the other option. The trick with Mesos and Marathon for us, I think, will be can we make the developer experience, relatively seamless with what they're running on their local machines versus what we run.
How is the Mesos experience for you? How's it been?
We haven't
even tried it.
No, we're still in the
You're just still checking.
What's the ecosystem look like? Yeah.
Well, I guess my question then would be, why would you say that about your developers having the familiarity with it? Is it just because it's a new UI?
Not so much familiarity, but
it's not intended for use on like an individual person's laptop.
Yeah.
They're not going to run a Mesos cluster. That's not going to happen.
Right.
No.
The stuff with Docker Machine also looks interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
What is it that looks interesting?
Well, what made you interested in it?
Well, I think that it bridges that gap in terms of like provisioning hosts. So you say, okay, well, if you can kind of assemble the it's really I think the Docker Machine and Docker Swarm together is what makes it interesting. So if you say, okay, I can get the virtual the VirtualBox backed host on my local development environment that is going to be very friendly to, say, a front end developer who is not particularly well versed with standing up servers and things like that, and then take that exact same Docker Compose thing and with the appropriate scaling and apply that same thing with a say EC2 provisioner for machine would be very powerful.
I particularly like the fact that we wouldn't necessarily have to be using boot to Docker specifically the way we are now,
right,
because giving people the ability to just go right to EC2, I mean, of course they can run locally as well, but removing some friction for the experience of launching their own instances in EC2 would be easier than some of the tooling that we've built over the years with like Fabric and
Sure.
thousands of lines of Python that are maybe a little impenetrable for the theoretical front end if we're talking about who just wants to launch the stuff and see it work.
So right to the Fabric then.
So instead of using like the fab commands that we would use now to launch EC2 instances, they would use Docker Machine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I know you guys have had a long conference, so thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us here at the New Stack and the New Stack Analyst Show, and appreciate your openness, and we look forward to just keeping in touch about what you're doing.
Great.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, too.
Scott, should we keep chatting here for a minute? Do you have any thoughts you want to finish up with?
Let's see. Thoughts on a very short, very compact, very compressed, but still very expressive show. I think this organization has evolved dramatically in a short period of time. I think they took a big step, and I mean big. When people call my grandfather big, it was because he did big things. He stepped in and got people together. He made people friends with each other, and they say, now that's really big of you, Scott Sr. So when I say Docker Incorporated has done some big things, by settling some arguments, maybe doing a little better than postponing them, but settling some arguments, some over the container format, some over producing a universal runtime for that. I think they have taken some great steps forward for themselves. And even from a strategic perspective, by contributing Run C, the new universal runtime, to the Open Container project, essentially Docker Incorporated helps to seed whatever comes out of OCP with some Docker DNA. It means that whatever people decide a competing container format should look like, it's going to have a lot of Docker in it. So it keeps a lot of Docker's foundation in there, and it forces any competitors to have to differentiate on different levels of service, not just on the basic content and format of the container, but on packaging, customer service, and things like that.
I think one of the things I find is the striking impact that it continues to have on companies such as VMware, and how that is affecting kind of the overall innovation around, for instance, hypervisors.
Mm-hmm.
We saw some announcements from VMware this week, an API-driven hypervisor, and Project Bonneville, which is Docker oriented,
mm-hmm.
and those to me are really an example, I think, of how there is a new era that we're seeing here. We are starting to see this beginning of a new cycle of the way that we see applications getting architected, and far more that is far more about the infrastructure than anything else. It's about that application architecture, and to see companies like VMware come into this with such thought about how containers work with VM environments, to me is an interesting development.
Well, let's not just assume that VMware is completely altruistic about this and doesn't have any self-serving aspects.
It's not about altruism whatsoever. I think it's about them having to think a little bit more about their existing hypervisor technologies, mm-hmm. and how they're going to adapt, mm-hmm. and how they're going to reach out more to developers. And I don't think it's altruistic in any sense, but I think it is about seeing them trying to really kind of think about different things. But maybe they're trying to isolate Docker to some extent, and and focusing on the hypervisor by putting containers in this insulated environment. There are lots of motivations.
Well, you have to think about what kind of business is VMware in. VMware is in the business of managing layers of abstraction. Wherever there are platforms that would create a kind of a fixed stack, VMware has come in with layers of abstraction, has separated the components of those platforms like dividing Lego bricks, and provided tools with which to manage the layers of abstraction in between. That's how It got to wedge in virtualization and the virtual machine environment that we see now. That's how it kind of broke the back of the original operating system stacks that especially Microsoft was forming. So along comes Docker and the container concept, and it shows that, hey, you can have virtualization on a completely different way. So VMware has to think, well, what do we do to compete with that? And at first, we hear a lot of talk about, well, they haven't come up with a security model yet. And then there was a theme from VMware that says the right tools and the right controls come from the right management ecosystem, and you need controls to be able to stay compliant, to remain in governance, and you don't want to upset the apple cart too much. That message didn't really take root with too many companies. So what we had here is an evolved form of that message in the last week or so with Project Bonneville, and with a new term that VMware is seeded into the vocabulary here, which is micro-segmentation.
Yeah.
Micro-segmentation is the idea that you have little clusters of containers, which maybe Kubernetes would call pods, and maybe these would be stateless and maybe not. But the idea is you have them wrapped together in a little network, and then you create a stateless container, if you will, around them. A stateful container around them, and that stateful container would serve as the firewall. This is what VMware does. They come into an industry, they create layers of abstraction, and they give you the tools with which to manage them. So when it could not compartmentalize Docker into its own subset, its own niche, and it couldn't scare customers away from it by saying, well, it's inherently insecure, seeing that it's going to progress as far as it is, it is VMware's form of embrace and extend, which is, every time I say that, I visualize Bill Gates with his arms outstretched. Embrace and extend is the idea of agreeing that an architecture is working a certain way, but also setting the parts of the stack up to fall in your favor. And I think this is what VMware are very smartly trying to do. They have their own operation and their own infrastructure to maintain. They made a smart move. I think Docker played right into VMware's hands, and I think we're going to see micro-segmentation as a factor in the public discussion for at least the next year.
Good. You wrote stories about the Docker plugins.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote about Docker networking.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote about this universal format, run C.
Mm-hmm.
There are a few other stories you wrote too. Those are three that I recall most of all. Which of those three was most striking and interesting to you that gave you some new insights into the ecosystem and thinking about new stories and developments that we'll see as we go into the second half of the year?
I was expecting some mobility on the Docker network. That was already pretty much in the mix. I was expecting some movement on the train of thought that Cluster HQ had started around PowerStrip that became the new Docker plugins concept that was premiered here. Now, Docker has had plugins in the past. A lot of people remind us, but this is a very pluggable plugin format, which the idea of PowerStrip is being able to plug in multiple plugins and have those plugins interoperate with one another, as was demonstrated here with Weave and Cluster HQ. Being able to move a container from place to place within a network, virtual network, and still have it bound to a database. This is a very necessary feature, and it resounded very well along a lot of people, which made it a very interesting development. But to some extent, we were expecting that. Run C threw us for a loop. That we did not see coming. That's so I'll admit to. Run C would have been, in my mind, 3 or 4 steps down the road. But surprise, they take it now. And I'm happy to see it. I think it is, as was obvious in some of the very late demos in the last stages of today with moving the containers that were playing the Doom game. Quake. I'm so out of the gaming. My apologies to all my friends in the gaming community who thought I was still kept up on this. They were playing Quake with each other, and they were moving the containers that played Quake between continents. They were doing it with a script that was called from RunC. RunC effectively created a series of circumstances which made it, for all intents and purposes, live migration. I mean, most intents and purposes. It is really, really, really close to live migration, and because containers are so small and so ephemeral and so portable, it in a lot of cases will achieve the same results as live migration. But we saw how very quick this was. And this was possible because you put a component in the container that was scriptable, that responds to sequences of commands, not just a command line that echoes what you give it. So it makes containers intelligent and intelligible. It puts them on a whole new level. And I think it was also a smart move to contribute that project to OCP. Apologies for the RoboCop reference. And I think by doing that, it ensured that in order to be applicable in future environments, all containers are going to have to speak a common language. That's an argument that we might have had next year, but we won't have it now. It's been settled for us in advance. RunC, I think, was the big architectural news of this conference.
Yeah. Here's to the plumbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Scott, thank you very much for joining us here at DockerCon, and all the stories you've written and doing this podcast. It's been a good show, and we'll be back again, hopefully, for the next DockerCon in Barcelona.
Delighted to be with you, and I hope to get invited to Barcelona. When I heard about that, my ears perked up. I can see that coming. My mouth is already watering.
Good.
Good to be with everyone.
Great. All right. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. That's it for this week's show. Thank you very much for joining us. Audio editing and sound design for the new Stack Analysts podcast is provided by Broken Hours. You can find them at brokenhours.com. Thanks again, and hope to see you back at the show. Bye-bye.